that, whether we are comparing, between hookups or being in relationships, there is this gap between men and women and their likelihood to have an orgasm. Women have the greatest likelihood of having an orgasm if they're in a relationship, and men do as well. But even then, there is that gap of 85 versus 68%. And the less well they know their partner, the less likely they are to have an orgasm. Because if it's their first hookup, for instance, only 10% of women have an orgasm versus 31% of men having an orgasm. Now, this could be because we know that the things that oftentimes women say make them most likely to orgasm, which is having a combination of intercourse, oral, and self-stimulation, this is less likely to occur um, when people are, and you can kind of see that, whoops, I went backwards. You can kind of see that in that data that, it's when all those things occur that women are most likely to have an orgasm. But oftentimes, especially outside of relationships, there's also what we call the oral sex gap, where women are much more likely to give oral sex than receive oral sex. And so all of this, of course, is related to those sexual scripts. Now, certainly for younger women, part of what contributes to those sexual scripts, that concern over the sexual double standard, that orgasm gap, is that in the last, I'm trying to do the math in my head because, they first started talking about hookups and hookup culture when I was in college. So I guess, yeah, we'll say like in the last 20 to 25 years, there's been this kind of focus on this kind of new sexual context, and that is hooking up. And so, your book talks about, there isn't this clear-cut definition of what it means to hook up. Like, a lot of people think that it has to always mean uh, having sex. But there are definitely ways of defining hookup that might relate to just fondling or just oral sex. It doesn't always mean intercourse. Sometimes it might even just mean kissing. But the kind of key thing about a hookup is it is occurring in a context where you are not necessarily, it hasn't been preceded by going on a date. And even if it occurs regularly, it does not necessarily relate to expectations that you are in a committed relationship, or certainly it doesn't relate to expectations that your partner has to share, that you are, in a relationship, a meaningful relationship. While hookups, are more predominant among younger people. So you want to think 25 and younger, and they are particularly predominant on college campuses, particularly residential college campuses. It's not like everyone who is in that age group or in that setting is engaging in this type of behavior. And it doesn't mean that people who are older and are not in the college setting don't necessarily also engage in hookup behavior. But certainly a lot of our research and data has come from colleges in particular. So, and typically your kind of typical traditional college age students. So your 18 to 22-year olds. And so, why do people hook up? Off sexual attraction, of course, kind of being a primary one. They've hooked up before. Very few people hook up because they want a relationship, but certainly, some people do hope that a relationship will result from hooking up, and we'll talk about that more in an upcoming slide. And then, of course, there's the role of alcohol and drugs, because hookups are much more likely, alcohol and drugs are much more likely to play a role in a hookup situation than in a date situation. So why? Why does alcohol and drugs play a larger role? Once again, some of this has a lot to do with the fact that, our research is coming from that college setting. And over time, there has just been a close relationship, association, if you will, between, college, particularly residential college. So, the college where you live in a dorm and you're away from your parents. You're surrounded by people your same age and your same kind of situation, in terms of being, full-time students and probably unmarried and probably without kids, and parties. And so, the association between college and parties is a long-standing one. Now, where that association really changed, as your book mentioned, was in the late 1980s. Because before that, alcohol played a role in college and in college settings, but it was because people were legally allowed to drink in a lot of states, at the age of 18. But in 1987, the drinking age was increased to 21 in all 50 states. And so what happened is, all the places where students could kind of drink openly before, at school parties, in their dorm rooms, public places, a lot of those opportunities to engage in perhaps more responsible drinking dried up. And instead, now students if they were drinking illegally and underage. And so what happened was the Greek system, which had, very, very deep roots in higher education, even before this. The first fraternity were the Kappa Alphas, and that was in 1825. And in fraternities, and then later in fraternities and sororities, but particularly fraternities, had already had a long and established history of, having kind of, wild parties and hazing rituals and debauchery. But especially once people weren't able to legally drink in other places, the Greek system developed a real niche. Because even though these houses were located on campus, on most campuses, these houses were private, which meant that it was harder for the universities to regulate the drinking and partying behavior of the students in these houses compared to the students who were in like regular dorms. And so as your textbook describes, what happened is even if you weren't necessarily Greek, for a lot of campuses, Greek life became very central to party life. And it also played an outsized role in how colleges were depicted in a lot of popular media. Oftentimes fraternities and sororities, and those types of activities, people would see those depictions in popular TV shows and movies, and they would come to college expecting that type of experience. And so in that type of setting where you have a bunch of young people, usually binge drinking, heavily inebriated, these aren't the types of settings where smart decisions are getting made, or people making decisions about, who they want to date seriously and possibly marry one day. Instead, a focus kind of becomes on having fun, engaging in risky behavior, and hookups. And so you have the rise of hookup culture kind of happening, in this setting of colleges and party culture and drinking. Now, and it becomes, if not the predominant way in which young people in colleges structure their relationships, it becomes the predominant way in their mind that they think people are structuring the relationship. So they imagine that everyone is hooking up, even if they themselves aren't doing it. And even though, the data does not support the fact that everyone is in fact hooking up, because in fact, not everyone is. Once again, there is the role of, in your book talks about this, there is the role of race, and it's some of the same terms that, had been discussed previously. There's the hierarchy of social desirability, but then there's also a little bit of respectability politics happening where, minorities, people of color, feel like it's important for them to uphold a certain image. Much more, important for them to uphold a certain image because there are less of them on campus. And that's particularly true if they're at a PWI, a predominantly white institution. There's the role of social class, which your book talks about. People that go to college that are working class, working poor, whether they're there on scholarship or having to work part-time jobs, they're oftentimes much more concerned about their grades and much more fearful of flunking out. And not to mention, it's really, if you're talking about the Greek system, like Greeks that have houses, it's really expensive to participate in that culture, to pledge, to rush, to live in a house. All of that takes money. So, people that are more disadvantaged in terms of their social class are just less likely to participate, and they perceive it as being riskier. And there's actually some evidence that suggests that for working class, working poor girls, it is riskier, that these upper class, these higher social class men are much more likely to sexually assault them than women who share their social class background. And so, so in that way, it's doubly risky. And then, of course, just the role of gender. Once again, with that sexual double standard, women that overtly participate in the hookup culture, even though it is to some extent more acceptable and tolerated on college settings, they still run the risk of being labeled and being judged and being stigmatized, much more so than college-age men do. Perhaps in those types of settings is where you still see maybe the clearest illustration of that slut versus stud distinction. Oh, I'm going backwards. Let me go forward. Now, as I mentioned, some people are motivated to hook up because what they really want are relationships. However, what's happened in these settings is the pathway to a relationship has become less clear because of hookup culture. And so what you have now is what some people label backwards dating, right? Where instead of dating, getting to know someone, and then maybe becoming more sexually intimate with them, what happens instead in some situations is that people they start where they used to end, right? They're sexually intimate with a person, they hook up, but then they continue to hook up, and then they spend more time with them, and then they hang out, and then maybe they wind up dating. And it does happen that way, but it doesn't happen oftentimes as much as people, particularly women, based on the research that's been done, particularly that they would want. And so because you're not clear-cut dating, but you can have this kind of established, even maybe long-term hookup relationship, what you have is this very vague language, right? You're talking, you're hanging out, you're dating, but not in a relationship. And so all of this is just, purposefully vague, and it adds this element of insecurity, and it strips away expectations and obligations, relational obligations. And so what oftentimes happens is that, people do not oftentimes feel empowered in these relationships over time, and particularly women. And whether that's because, the woman does want a relationship, she is moving with that relational imperative, or in some cases, it's not so much that she wants a relationship, but that she, does not want to be negatively judged and stigmatized, which much more so than her male counterpart, she's really running that risk of doing so if she is overtly participating in this hookup culture. And your book talks about how, for both men and women, it's a cold, mean, in some cases, context, because they conflate caring with monogamy, right? you can be considerate and non-monogamous. You can be respectful and non-monogamous. You could hook up with someone and still be nice and still be respectful and still be considerate of their feelings and their sexual experience. But they said what's happened is that caring gets associated with relationships, and because hooking up is seen as being not that, oftentimes like the hookups just kind of result in, these kind of relations that are, if not if not flagrantly disrespectful, just kind of inconsiderate. Once again, probably contributing to that orgasm gap. And so it raises this concern, particularly for young women. People just in general seem to be less concerned about sex when it comes to men. And I'm not saying that that's rightfully so. It's just a sexual script that we have, that women need to be protected from sexual, behaviors that are potentially predatory and exploitative. And, we don't have that same sexual script for men, particularly, heterosexual men. And so, there's this debate, and some people feel like it's problematic because it places women at risk. Some people just, find it problematic because in general, they're just kind of all worked up about the idea that people are out here having casual versus meaningful sex. And some people find it problematic because they're concerned when people embrace it as being questionable empowerment. Like, how is it really empowering to sleep with a bunch of men, or, to, have a bunch of random hookups? So, if you're trying to answer that from a research standpoint, what does the evidence suggest? Well, certainly there are some risks, and certainly the empowerment is questionable. And that has a lot to do with the sexual double standard, and then just the sexual disrespect that exists in fraternity and party culture. It doesn't have to exist, but the way it's set up now, it often does. The expectation that for a lot of these themed parties, that women are supposed to be, the men are oftentimes fully dressed while the women are in costumes that are like, half dressed, half naked. That there is this expectation that are agreeing to be like groped, just by your presence at those parties. So it's just a disrespect issue. And then, of course, the other reason is that, or another reason why it's seen as problematic, is because it, by and large, just results in bad sexual experiences. You can go back and look closely at some of those graphs, but for the most part, there's that persistent orgasm gap. When you're having sex with someone who you don't really know, who doesn't really care about you, they are less invested, generally speaking, in women having a good time, and you can see that in the rates of giving oral sex, making sure that she has an orgasm. That data does just suggest that, if you think about women being sexual objects versus subjects, that kind of distinction becomes much more apparent in these hookup settings, or hookup contexts, than in relationship contexts. But that doesn't mean that, the research, suggests that relationships are inherently better. One thing that is certainly true is that hookups take less time than relationships. In particular, people who study, women's kind of social and romantic lives in college settings, one concern that comes up is what's called greedy relationships. That when women are in relationships, they oftentimes divest from other activities and academic experiences, and they are more apt to prioritize that relationship, which, to a certain extent defeats the purpose of being, there in college, where, you're hoping you're prioritizing some of those educational experiences. Certainly, in the same way that a bad sexual experience might result in, someone becoming upset or anxious or depressed and their grades going down, there's also evidence that suggests that relationships, even when they're not bad, even when they're good, but they're just greedy in the sense that they take up a lot of time, also negatively impact women's academic achievement, their GPAs. So this is almost kind of a double bind situation, to bring up a term that we've used in previous chapters.